Hey there, this is Jenny Clark with Solvability. We're at GovCon Summit and talking about CMMC and its impact on small business in Florida. I've got with me today Tim Jones with Cyber Corporation, who's been in this industry a long time. I've got Donna Huneycutt of WWC Global, who's grown up in this industry and has so much to share. And she asked me if I would include Bo Quisenberry, who is her CISO, to talk about it. So Tim Jones, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you guys tell us what we need to know.
Outstanding. Thank you, Jenny, and appreciate you inviting me to speak today. I'm going to start off with talking about some generalities of concerns that small companies and even mid-sized companies should have with CMMC, or things they should look out for. And then Donna and Bo are going to talk and give you real examples that have happened and some other information as well. But I think their numbers are going to surprise a few people of what the reality is. Okay, because the government says one thing, when you start digging into it, the reality of the situation might be quite a bit different than what they're telling you. So first of all, what it gets down to is cost. Everything's, cost drives everything, especially in small business. A business has to start out with a gap analysis of where they're at. And it has to be more than a technical gap analysis. They have to look at the legal gap analysis as well. So you've got to take a look at all your contracts and find out what you're required to do legally, and then do a cross-reference with those legal requirements to your technical gap analysis. When you do that, you've got to figure out what's it going to cost to fill those gaps once you identify them, both the technical and legal. All right, and that's money. From there, you got to, once you get all that situated and you get your ducks in a row with all your paperwork for your maturity level that you're looking to do, then you have to pay for that audit. Okay. There's people involved when you do that. Okay, there's people involved that you had to hire to do your analysis. Those costs add up really quick. Then after you do your audit, you have to remember every 3 years you have to recertify. Well, during that 3 years, guess what? You got to maintain that cyber hygiene that you've set up. So you may have been a 2, but now maybe you only qualify as a 1 because you didn't do your cyber hygiene. So that cost continues. It does not go away. There's one thing that's very important, Jenny, I think y'all mentioned in your last session, or you may have mentioned it real recently, and that's evidence of compliance. One of the biggest things that C3PAO is going to be looking for is that your documentation that you have, yes, it's all in order, but did you start following this documentation weeks or months ago? Because that's not going to work. You're going to have to show that you've got proof that you've been doing this for a much longer period of time. And they prefer years to weeks and months. That's going to absolutely be huge on any of the audits. With that, I think that's a good quick overview of the generalities. I think Donna now can give you some examples of the actual impacts that those generalities have. Donna?
Yes, so both great examples. I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we got here. Personally, how I got here, as I mentioned, was I started a company by mistake. But my original background was I was an M&A attorney. And as an M&A attorney, you're always making deals, you're always looking at valuations. And so I was often looking at the valuations of small firms and large firms wanting to buy them, and what the perspective looked like from the small firm in terms of reinvestment in the company, and what that looked like from the perspective of the large firm. It was a very different look, frankly. And then I also dealt as an attorney with software licensing. I spent a summer at a place called Iona Technologies, kind of being the control on the promises made by the software salespeople to the customers. And that was really interesting, because that was the first time I ran into the tension between sales and risk mitigation, which they don't have to be a zero-sum game. But if you're not careful, they will be. And so you're balancing the deal of trying to make the sale versus the sustainability of what it is you're trying to sell, and then you're trying to quantify the risk that goes along with that. So in M&A, all of those things have numbers attached to them, and so that's kind of what I'd like to talk about. Finally, I've been active at the National Defense Industrial Association, working on small business issues and procurement issues, and I'm I've been asked to speak on behalf of small businesses. So over the course of the last couple of years, since 2017, I've kind of watched the CMMC initiative within DoD grow and really take hold. So as you know, at the end of 2017, the government was scrambling for a plan. We had Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks, and then Reality Winner. And then shortly after that, we had somebody selling submarine blueprints, which basically was giving away billions of dollars of intellectual property developed in US industries. So this went from being a DoD concern to really being very visible and political. And then President Trump appointed Katie Arrington. But in 2017, this was really still just a DFARS clause. And I thought, okay, this is going to be another exercise in compliance. I'll write the policy. I'll make sure we follow it. It'll be fine. And like a lot of the other speakers, dug in and thought, oh my God, the cost of hardware, the stateside insourcing of stuff that had been outsourced offshore, the FTEs required to sustain the documentation and evidence the compliance, as Tim mentioned, the expensive retrofitting that a lot of companies are going to have to do because they've already set up their system. So they have to now dismantle them and put them back together. The hours, the labor hours involved by people not on the IT department, right? The labor hours for training all of your frontline staff. The fuzziness of what constitutes compliance at each company size. The good news was that the initial way that the DFARS clause was supposed to work, and I wasn't in the room where it happened, but I was in the room where it was discussed and debated. It was initially supposed to be self-implementing in 2017 and effective the day that it became effective. And I remember being in policy discussions saying, well, wait a minute, Policymaking 101 says you can't have something be effective the day you implement it, especially if it's 17 domains and 110 points of compliance. You need to give people an opportunity to comply. Now, the biggest champion of this in 2017 at the Pentagon said, oh, we know that, but cybersecurity is really, really important. And so we're just going to pass the rule and then we're not going to enforce it. To me, that was very telling, because my sense was if that was the case, the business community was going to get that message and roll the dice. A lot of us small businesses, we have to, I can tell you right now, we do not print double-sided on paper, even though a lot of our FAR requirements say that we're supposed to, a lot of our clauses in our contracts say that we're supposed to. Might have to pay a big penalty for that one day. But you're always, balancing your priorities of how much to comply, and full compliance with everything is impossible. And sadly, oftentimes the contracting officers don't care. And we found ourselves sort of spending money on things like Department of Labor compliance that other firms are not. They roll the dice, they win the contract, they perform at a lower rate, they take the money, put it in their pockets and go home. So you need to create an environment where compliance is realistic and sustainable. So fortunately, this Pentagon official was challenged, and in 2017, we all probably had this mad scramble to make a POAM to implement cybersecurity, implement the NIST requirements over the next year. So in 2018, as part of that, we rolled out our dual factor authentication program, which is Okta. And this was before Bo was with us. We had this wonderful IT director still with us, Jennifer Wright, and she rolled it out overnight and then went to sleep, woke up in the morning. It was worldwide because we have locations all over the globe. She woke up and saw that there were 88 error messages and thought, holy smokes, what has gone wrong here? I was getting angry calls from my staff. This is a terrible product. The IT department doesn't know what it's doing. Why did we do this? I can't talk to my customers. Well, Jennifer looked at the error messages and noticed that if you neck them down, they all related to 4 cell phones. Now, we had just won a $200 million contract in Tampa. We were all over the newspapers as sort of the small firm that won the big whale of a contract to train our special operators. And when we necked down those error messages, it turns out that 4 of our vice presidents had constant hacking attacks on their Apple iPhones coming at them from quote unquote South Korea and quote unquote Ukraine. So right there, with us about to take on this sensitive mission of great magnitude and tremendous importance to the military, we were tremendously vulnerable. And if we had not had either the means or the impetus to implement this dual factor implementation, we were already being hacked. So in 2019, when I was at an NDIA industry meeting for people to talk with Patrick Shanahan about CMMC, and he said, well, cybersecurity is already, and people asked, how are companies supposed to pay for this? You know, are you going to increase the G&A that you're willing to pay to companies? And Patrick Shanahan, who his career was at Boeing, said, oh, no, that's already hardwired into the G&A and overhead of all companies. So I raised my hand and I said, well, you know, we've actually been implementing this as a small business, and I put together some numbers. And I happen to have a slide deck with me that I showed, and I showed exactly where the cost came from to just get to some real basic NIST compliance, NIST 800-171 compliance. And those costs were, for us, they had been $400,000 for implementation. And for ongoing maintenance, they added about 17 cents per labor hour. And I said, I need the government to understand that, you know, I don't want to lose contracts by 17 cents an hour because I was compliant and somebody else rolled the dice. So I think that the government is challenged with establishing a playing field where everyone really is incentivized to play, and you need to do that in a couple of ways. So someone at the small business office liked my slide deck, asked me to forward it, and they kind of backed down from that. I hope I had something to do with that. So the question remains for small businesses: do you try to comply? Do you reinvest in your business for compliance, or do you roll the dice? Every dollar that you reinvest in your G&A and your overhead is a dollar you don't put in your pocket and take home. That's deeply, personally, intimately meaningful to any small business owner. And the government needs to remember that. Here's some conditions that will encourage small businesses to roll the dice. When compliance is extremely expensive, and when getting that check in the box is not a sure thing. So it's kind of like gambling to get this certification. When enforcement is random or non-existent. And so I bring you back to that comment from the Pentagon official, well, we're not really going to enforce it. The third condition is when nobody in the industry is really doing it, and they're just kind of checking the box or getting that company that'll give them that easy, yes, they comply, and just moving on without any meaning. So, and again, I remind you, you know, as an M&A attorney, I knew that oftentimes when my large firm made a bid for my small firm at a certain price and looked under the hood and saw all sorts of liabilities in there, all sorts of possibilities they'll lose their business because they haven't actually been doing what they've been saying, all sorts of potential lawsuits out there, all sorts of potential liability, that translated into a loss in dollar value. And so if you kind of apply that axiomatic model to the military space and small defense companies, what that's really telling you is there's a certain price to that risk. And, you know, if the small business isn't paying it, the government is, whether they know it or not. So this is really a big challenge. So what do? Do you bake it into your G&A and overhead and kind of hope that you keep winning contracts even though your overhead and G&A is more expensive? Obviously, this is going to put small businesses at a disadvantage because we have a much smaller revenue base to spread it around, and it's going to make small businesses much more expensive than large businesses. But at the same time, the Biden administration wants to encourage more small business participation. So what's the answer? You know, and Jenny talked about the community taking action and speaking to our legislators and policymakers. One thing that I propose is the government say, look, if cybersecurity really is important, then they need to put their money behind that statement. And how do you do that? Either you ensure that you will reimburse companies that win a CMMC rated contract for the then implementation of the CMMC. Or if it's their first contract where they're getting CMMC, there just be a premium for the installation of that. I don't think the government's going to want to do that. It's simply too expensive. One idea, and I gave the government a couple of suggestions at the time when this was still being discussed. The idea that I like best, and the one that relates to the Tampa Bay area, is to create a center of gravity for CMMC compliance here in the Tampa Bay area, where you can sort of modularly purchase all the different components of compliance, right? You have someone who offers dual factor authentication, someone who offers templates for policies, someone who offers connectivity that is CMMC compliant, and that those be put together for each company in a way that's like a software as a service, and that the companies pay per capita. And I think that is an appropriate way to spread the cost of this implementation fairly across the defense industrial base. So that's what I've got. Bo is going to talk about the actual implementation in our firm.
Donna, I liked how you started, where you kind of outlined your career, and I think I want to start in the same way with my career. I started out, I was not in the military. I actually started out as a software developer. I eventually became a technical lead. I got into consulting. I eventually became a project manager. Finally left all that behind and owned my own business for a while. And owning your own business is very challenging. There's so many demands. Actually, after several years of that, I ended up leaving that and kind of reset and just went back to software development for a while, which is how I, oddly enough, or coincidentally, found my way to government contracting, which ultimately has led me to this place where I am now. I share that with you because I really have a heart for what company leaders have to go through and endure each and every day. And I really also have a heart for building IT foundational systems. And so I kind of want to just kind of marry those things with this compliance guidance and try to be both reassuring and maybe illuminating, lighting the way for the path. So when I think of the topic of this panel, what is the impact of CMMC, and I try to relate it to our organization, I think what I really want to do is try to relate our experiences, and then hopefully I'm packaging this up in a way where it's useful to hopefully a majority of this group. What makes my job a lot easier is having Donna and company leadership that really have a compass of true north and always trying to do the right thing. And so it allows me to really just focus on some of these practical steps that we have to take. So thinking about the impacts, it's kind of funny when I think about that holistically, the initial thought I have is the pain or the discomfort that we've had to feel in going through this. But as we've come through each step, what I'm starting to realize is we're achieving a higher level of efficiency in our organization. And so I do think there's a positive greater than just getting that checkbox, that certification that you can really get to. I think I just kind of want to highlight 3 impacts specifically. The first one is cost. I think both Tim and Donna did a fantastic job, but when I think about the hours spent, and in our case, we hired an analyst to help us, it's a lot of money. When I think about that number that Donna said, about 17 cents on the dollar, that's really profound. I do think what we've tried to do to mitigate that cost, or where I'm really starting to see that efficiency is, in our case, what we opted to do is we hired somebody that had that education, but opted to utilize our other IT resources to help kind of bring that person's skill set along. And what I mean by that is we hired somebody that had the education, but was fairly new to IT, but had a strong professional background. So this person has, at a discount almost, been providing really high level documentation, policies, and plans that are necessary to get that CMMC compliance. So I think we're really starting to see an efficiency with that person as well, being able to dual hat that person into other roles. Second, I kind of want to allude to the access controls that we've had to put into place. Much of what we did or were doing even 12 months ago was very tribal. There was a lot of direct reach outs for access to file systems, documents, etc. And that's not sustainable long term. And so it's been painful, but we've done a lot of just really boiling that whole domain down into one sentence, creating role-based access. And we've done this in a way where now we're really starting to see the fruits of doing that. So even outside the construct of CMMC, when somebody wants access to a resource, there's an identified owner, there's an identified role-based chart, and there's a defined set of systems. And pretty much we can just take that cross-section and have that owner fill out the form in effect. And we're able to assign access very swiftly. Now I think we've got it down to where we can run a script and it runs in a couple of minutes. And it's very efficient. So from that pain point has come this great efficiency. And I won't go into any details on the last one. Donna really touched on the multi-factor authentication and I was going to talk about extraneous pain points. And I think Donna did a really good job of highlighting that last example that I had. So finally, one other thing I kind of want to touch on is cloud versus classic network setup. WWC Global is a remote headquarters structure. And so for us, even pre-COVID, we're very comfortable operating remotely. All of our systems are cloud-based. And when it comes to CMMC, that has some advantages. There are some things we don't have to consider, like how to protect our networks, how to protect a set of servers. So we can pretty much opt right out of those practices, but it brings up a whole new set of challenges that I think the guidance is a little muddy because the NIST, which the CMMC is based off of, largely was written with that classic network server infrastructure in mind. So what I think I want to do here is just point out two things. One is make sure that if you are segmenting your systems in a way where you're using the cloud, and particularly if you intend to store CUI in the cloud, that you've cross-checked your vendor with the FedRAMP marketplace. I think that's a very practical step that anybody can take and is a very necessary step that you must take. The other item I want to share is be familiar with the DoD Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide. It's a very long document, but it really does illuminate what is necessary for cloud computing. So if you are a cloud-based app, if you're a company that is using cloud systems, make sure you have familiarity with that document. Jenny, do I have 1 minute? I have one more thing I want to talk about. I'm getting the thumbs up. Okay, fantastic. I don't know if we have anybody here that is wondering where to start, but I just want to take that 1 minute, give that practical, where do I go? What do I do first? And I think the most important thing you do first, because the guidance is so vast and there's so much of it, what you do is you go to the level 1 practices defined in the CMMC main document. That main document, it's a 20-page document. It's not very, very big. And in that document, it does list out the practices. There's 171, only 17 of them are level 1. And further, those level 1 practices map to the FAR clause 52.204.21. So if you intend to work in the DoD space, you really need to be tracking to those 17 practices, as well as that FAR clause. That's the most practical guidance I can give you. I think from there, I think Tim did a fantastic job of alluding to the gap analysis that you have to do, figure out what your organization needs in terms of where it might certify. Level 1 certainly is an option, particularly if you're not doing anything that requires a high level of security. If you are anticipating, or you already store FUO and you're certainly anticipating that you will be storing CUI, you really need to be aiming for level 3. And then finally, beyond that, the level 4 and 5 is very advanced. If you're going that direction, you're probably already ahead of the things that I've talked about at this point. Finally, once you do that gap analysis, the last thing you need to do is develop a system security plan. It's the first thing you should do after the level 1 practices, and it does check one of the level 2 practice boxes. And that system security plan illuminates the path for your organization on where it's going and how it's going to achieve whatever level of compliance you're trying to achieve. Finally, if I just were stating the bottom line, I would just say that you have somebody on your staff that reads and understands the guidance at the high level, and that the guidance is intended to be, in the spirit of it, it's intended to be good to secure your organization. Thank you.
You're muted, Jenny.
Hey, thank you so much, Bo. Tim, how about back to you?
Okay, yeah, a couple of things. Let me carry on a little bit about what Bo was talking about, the maturity levels. Maturity level 1, yes, absolutely. Every company should be going for that one up front right away. 17 practices, get on with it. There's no processes. And I think pretty much every company obviously will achieve that, and it's achievable. Maturity level 2, it's one of the many things I was not understanding about CMMC. So I decided to go ahead and take the registered practitioner courses to see if I couldn't get some more answers. Well, I did that, and now I'm a registered practitioner. I have no more answers, unfortunately. So it really didn't help me there. But the way I see maturity level 2 is it's fairly useless. It buys the government absolutely nothing, because you go from FCI to CUI. Well, that's 1 to 3. So other than making the CMMC AB and their supporting contractors money, I don't see where it adds anything whatsoever. Okay, so understand that it needs to be done because it's an iterative process, but you're not going to gain anything until you get to level 3, which actually is going to be the differentiator, because everybody's going to be level 1. So people like SOCOM, pretty much everything they put out is going to be level 3 because they need that differentiator. Just keep that in mind. The other thing I'd like to add is, because I could not get the answers from CMMC yet, is to keep this in mind. Whenever you get that certification and you're doing your maintenance, make sure you document if you add a branch office. What happens if you change your network architecture? Built in into your subcontracts, if you're a prime, that you can spot check your subs. Are they being compliant? Because if not, you can lose your contract. Just keep those things in mind that we don't have answers for yet. And I don't think the CMMC has come up with those answers yet, but at least they've heard the question. We'll see if they come back with answers. That's all I've got.
Well, I think that's really helpful to be talking about. One of the things that we have been discussing, to me, is a prime contractor is going to be very risk averse, and they're going to have people lined up that are already at a higher level. And I'm glad you told me that about CMM level 2 kind of being meaningless. So it's basically you're either 1 or you're 3. And I think what we were talking about, which really led to all of this, is Tim and Donna and I and several other people were on a call with Enterprise Florida discussing what is this and what it will take. And Donna, I think you did a fabulous job on that call describing how much investment it took, how many people you've got working on this full time. And I wonder if you'd mind talking a little bit more about that, the impact on you as a small business with a couple hundred people. I mean, obviously you're a very advanced contractor because you are supporting SOCOM globally, but would you mind just saying, ouch, this hurts?
Oh God, yes. I mean, just the implementation, right? So, the implementation took place when we were doing, I don't even remember, $15 million a year in business. And the implementation was almost $500,000. So as you can see, for 1 year, for more than 1 year, we had to forgo a great deal of profit. And that's that critical decision point that I was talking about. Do I invest or do I not invest? Now, the government, depending on which part of the government is speaking, says very contradictory things. It says, well, we want to sweep in sort of commercial firms, and we want to increase competition, and we want to be innovative, and we want to bring in non-traditional military firms. But then they're asking for companies doing business with the government to get CMMC ready, which means whatever cybersecurity they may have in place, which might be fantastic, they're going to have to dismantle and then find a way to comply with CMMC. So they're kind of, there's not, I think, a lot of uniformity in how this is all supposed to work. Like the bottom line as a business person is who's paying, right? And again, if either the small businesses are paying or the government is paying, or the government is paying without knowing it, really in the form of risk.
Well, and I think you gave a great example when you were talking about valuation. Because my biggest concern with all of this is there are companies that are going to invest in it, meet the requirements, that they're going to have a higher valuation, but their cost may be higher. And so it's going to make them less competitive. And that is really a big area. I think that, over the years that I've worked in federal contracting, price has always been an issue, whether they say it is or not. How many times you heard that phone call? Yeah, that all they did was undercut us. And that happens so frequently. Now, theoretically, we're no longer in a lowest price, technically acceptable or LPTA world, but we all know we are. Because if you're not price competitive, you're going to be knocked out. You may not be knocked out as quickly, but there's been so many rising costs for small businesses over the years. The rising cost of protests, the cost of delays, the fact that we all just had to go through a global pandemic, and you and Tim as business owners really took over the largest part of that risk, protecting your workforce and keeping everything going. And it's like, what are they going to throw at small business? And that's why it's so important for the defense small business communities to be working together. And I'm so glad that Donna, you and Tim have both taken such a leadership role in this, because you're basically picking up the cost for all the other small businesses by the participation that you're doing in the, we're there even though we didn't really want to be the leaders in this.
Yeah, my firm is led by an attorney and someone that came out of the White House. We have very guilty consciences, and we will comply even though we know no contracting officer is really looking at it. There's a structural challenge, as I'm sure I'm sure this has been discussed ad nauseum. The contracting officer is done when their action is done. When they've awarded the contract, they're done. They don't have a vested interest in terms of their own job performance, in terms of their own career trajectory, about what happens once they throw it over the fence to execution. So you end up with a situation where, because of nobody taking ownership of the cost of actual compliance, right, we sort of do away with it tacitly, right? We lower the prices we're willing to pay. We take that contractor that we're not going to ask if they're compliant or not, but they're going to be cheaper. And then we're going to put the compliant one out of business and make it impossible to both comply and be competitive on price, because we're not going to be realistic about the costs we're imposing on businesses. And that might be a great short-term policy. It was one of the ways that we shrank the DoD budget in the last decade, but it is a terrible long-term policy for the health of the defense industrial base, certainly for our competitiveness against our near peers.
I think that's really important. And Tim, you know, you've been on the Tampa Bay Defense Task Alliance for a long time. I know Donna is the current president, but you've been really following this topic for a long time. How is the defense community statewide talking about this? Could you add anything to that?
Yeah, the statewide, and we cover that from the Florida Defense Alliance as well. And we're very interactive with DEO and what they're doing. And I think you have a session coming up on that, so I won't spoil some of your talk with Ryan first and Larry. But yes, statewide, everyone is talking about it, including that even up to the governor's level, to say that there are problems. How do we solve it? Space Florida, we had some excellent conversations with Space Florida, and they're looking at putting together a program, sort of what we've been talking about here, of a certified data center that offers multiple packages to meet level 1 through level 3. Okay, it won't be 100% solution, but it'll be that infrastructure that small business can't afford to offer. Okay, it's very costly. So you will still have to pay a monthly fee, but your costs are lowered because now you're sharing the cost of that infrastructure. So that's something that we're working on from the state level, and hopefully we can get something worked out with Space Florida and get that on the market, but no news yet. It's just in the infancy.
There's so much opportunity for some coordinated organization to step in and take the lead. Honestly, there's a market opportunity here, I think, to make a lot of money by putting together something that's largely plug and play, and software as a service or cybersecurity environment as a service.
Well, that's really good to know. We had a great question from Alan Elliott. Alan is a Navy veteran in Texas that's been working on this. So Alan, you have to come off mute and I can add you in.
And I can answer his question.
Okay, perfect. Tim, I'll just sit back and let you answer the question then. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, everyone, if you went into chat, you can see Alan's question. And what he's asking is, can large businesses utilize a cloud solution in granting small business subcontractors access with their limited cloud, where they can verify the small business at a level 1 and is DFARS compliant before granting access, blah, blah, et cetera. The short answer is sort of. And the reason is that small business still has to be certified on their own as level 1. But where that really comes into play is if your prime has a requirement that is really for a level 3 access and you're level 1 and you're not certified level 1, they can have that information in a certified level 3 situation, whether it's in their headquarters or in a cloud, and they can grant you access. And as a level 1 company, you can have access to that level 3 information. So that's the only place where that would come into play. You would still only be a level 1 company, but you could have access to that level 3 information because it stays in that level 3 certified facility.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was wanting to hear, right? So from a small business perspective, if we only have to do, let's say, the 17 practices, then that's manageable for a small business. You know, your larger corporations, if you're, if I'm subbing to a Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Raytheon or something of that nature, that could be a solution that I think, industry starts to have that conversation, kind of taking it on the chin for the little guys, right?
Absolutely.
I think it is very similar to how we did it. We worked in a special program environment, right? That's what my background is. Okay. So we would provide, machine names, locations, things of that nature, but with a virtualized environment, all you need now is IP addresses, computer names, things of that nature. So it could really alleviate or ease the burden on small business, and then prime contractors can make a ton of money on their end also. So I think that might be something that a conversation that the industry needs to have when it comes to CMMC, because again, this is very similar to 2014 when we rolled out JC. It is the exact same thing we're going through, and we got a lot of people up in arms about it. And it's really, if we look at the special program environment, we can really take that model and apply it to industry. Thank you.
You're welcome, and it definitely works.
Well, that's a great point. Hey, I would like to ask one other question. One of the things that I've been talking to my small businesses about is the place where you're going to be called on to talk about CMMC is the same place you're frequently called on to talk about your DCAA compliance level. It's going to be in the reps and certs that the prime contractors send out. Don, I'm just wondering if you're seeing that on anything that you're a sub to, or maybe how you're addressing it since you have so many more prime contracts. Because in a way, it's almost like when a small business gets a rep and cert and fills out the blank, and sometimes they call me and say, they read me the question. I said, well, I think you're okay. Let's go ahead and say yes. How could small business be prepared, or how are primes addressing that? Any thoughts on that?
Well, so the D1st clause is already there. So if you're signing a Department of Defense contract, you are very likely already obligated to have implemented the NIST 800-171 standards, whether you like it or not, whether you chose to or not. So at that point, really the only choice is whether you've actually done it or not. With respect to CMMC, my understanding is that this year, 15 of those 15 contracts are going to include a CMMC level requirement, and the contracting officers need to ask for permission to include it in their solicitations. Next year, they're going to go to 75, and as everyone has said, full participation by 2026. What we have found has sort of made a lot of that, overcome by experience or something, or OBE. Things happen in the interim. And essentially what happened in the interim was Huawei and the Chinese espionage via subcomponents in all sorts of phones and computers and cameras and such, coupled with COVID. So what happened to us was in COVID, mercifully, we got out of it okay, and the government was wonderful, letting our employees work from home. But unless they gave them a computer, we now had our employees using their own computers. And in certain cases, we actually gave them a company computer, which is an expense, right? But in some cases that were much lower risk, they were using their own computer with the government's approval, and they're using their own phone. And at the same time, we're being asked to sign a representation that says that we don't have any prohibited software in providing the services. So that's a really interesting clause to read, because what does that mean? If someone dials in from their home phone to a meeting because they're working from home because of COVID restrictions, and if I haven't verified whether their telephone has Huawei components in it or not, can I ensure that we're not using prohibited technology? And the answer is no. And so that went along with our whole effort to be NIST 800-171 compliant and CMMC compliant, and we just did the whole thing together and said, here's the policy, and we won't do that without sign off from the customer.
Well, I think that it's every time somebody says, "Isn't there just a checklist?" It's like, actually, there's not. It's up to a lot of decision makers to evaluate their risk, to look at the cost, and I think that Donna, you did an exceptional job of explaining it, and it's because of your background as an attorney that you really understood the complexity of these issues and take them seriously. And so often we're just looking for a simple answer, like, can I still use LastPass? Which is not really the question that should be asked. And that's really why we have this GovCon Summit idea of bringing people together that have a shared interest in small business and their survival and acceleration in the federal market, and creating ways that they can learn from each other and elevate the industry altogether. So thank you guys all so much for being on. Tim Jones with Cybrix, Donna Huneycutt with WWC Global, and Bo Quisenary also with WWC Global, talking to us about the impact of CMMC on small business. Any last remarks from anybody?
I just want to say thank you, Jenny. I love the service that you provide to this community, and I love your passion for this segment of the industry, and I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Jenny. You deserve a hand. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much.